Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, part number 12. So yesterday we were able to show the HTML from the request, etc. So that was a bit much more better than having like the HTML tag and looking like kind of ugly. But today what we're gonna do is we're gonna do two things, okay? The first one is gonna be a pretty simple fix. So we just want to fix this back issue where if I go there and I go back, that's perfect. But if I go there and I click on an episode and I click back, I'm getting back to the other navigator. So that's gonna be one of the fix. But the other one is gonna be to manage the library right there. So here it's gonna be a place where the user gonna have all these subscribe-ish kind of podcast. I mean, we don't gonna make the fully like a podcast player where we get notification when a new podcast came and stuff like that. The backend is kind of like pretty dumb. It's just like a GraphQL layer on top of a REST API. You don't do any kind of query each day to see if a new podcast came and stuff like that. But what I was thinking about, it's maybe showing something I never showed before, and also something I find no one else almost talk about. And this is kind of like using SQlite. So what I mean by that, it's a lot of the time you're gonna want to save some kind of offline data and thing like that. And a lot of people are gonna say, oh, go and use async storage and stuff like that. I like async storage, I use it a lot of the time, but I use it more for like a key value store. But when you need a bit more than that, I find SQlite it's kind of like the best. And when you work with real native app, this is something you're gonna use much more than what we use in React Native. So what you need to think about, what you need to understand about SQlite, it's kind of like the same SQlite you can use when you use your server and you use it like as a test database and stuff like that. So it's native also. It came already with iOS and Android and stuff like that. So it's pretty simple. And the beauty of this, it's gonna be something new we're gonna learn. And I think that's gonna be something you're gonna be pretty happy with what you can get with that. It's pretty simple to use. You just need to learn to know a bit about SQL, but nothing it's much more crazy than that. But yeah, it's gonna be fun. So that's gonna be the library we're gonna use. 2K star, it's pretty good. So yeah, first we're gonna fix the issue, the first issue. So remember, I get that, I click here, I go back, and it's break. So if you go to the main stack navigator and you click on your main tab navigator, you remember we did put this podcast navigator right there. I think that was an issue from my part. So what I want you to do is take those two, put that in the search, paste right there. And what I want you to do is copy that here, remove this one right there. I want you to use a search stack because that's the stack of this thing. Here after that, we're gonna add the other back title from here. So every time this search stack have a back title, that's gonna be this title. So now we can remove those two. And now we can delete this one right there. And now if everything's working, if I click here, boom, it crashed. And one sec, I think I forget to do something. That was a pretty an issue from my part. Is the font size perfect. So what happened right now, it's if you go to your search tile, so when you click on the element, we do a nested navigation. We do podcast and we pass the param like that. So what I want you to do is delete the nested and pass it right away to the podcast detail. So now if you search, example for full stack radio, and I click here, and now I click on this one, nothing have changed visually, but now if I click back, boom, now I get back to this one, and now you see, now it's much more better. And plus, if you click here and you swipe left, it's still the other one. So that was a pretty simple fix. Now the hardest part. First thing, we're gonna install the library. So it's React Native SQlite storage. So open a new terminal. Yarn add React Native SQlite storage. After that, this one, because remember we use type sync, you search for some types. If the library don't came with this type, and it don't came, as you can see, we have this one, but remember, go ahead and run npm install. So you need to rerun finally yarn to install the type package. After that, because this thing touched the native side, we're gonna need to do npx pod install. In Android, you don't need to do anything. So npx pod install to install the library as a code library finally. So it's going right there. And also, I think for this project, I would have used async storage because it's so much, it's a really simple app. But I really feel like this thing, it's something we want, it's something I want to show you because no one else really showed this kind of stuff on YouTube. And I feel it's something at least we should have as a tutorial. So after that, remember, you need to rerun npx React Native run Android or run iOS, just at least to get the compile stuff, because you need to install some library right to the simulator. And also, one of the beauty I like about using SQlite is the fact that we're gonna be able to use Table Plus, or you can use any kind of other database reader for SQlite. Perfect. So now everything looks perfect. So the first thing, the way I want to work, it's, so we use TypeScript, so why not using TypeScript for the right thing? So I'm gonna create a folder called contract, okay? And I'm gonna create an interface for my database. So I'm gonna call this one database contract.ts. The reason why I want to have that, it's because maybe later, interface, database contract. It's because maybe later you're gonna want to work with Realm or maybe like Watermelon DB or something like that. But you don't want to change all the layer. You just want to change the implementation, but where you use it, you don't want to change it. So that's kind of why we want to use interface. And it's something like I feel like a lot of people don't use a lot in TypeScript. It's using interface for really like kind of having the contract. We kind of like just use TypeScript as like just something on top of the JavaScript stuff, but why not using like the type system to make our code I feel much better. So I don't say here what I'm gonna show you it's the best thing. I think it's something we should do a bit more to make our life much more simpler. So here it's gonna be pretty simple. So this interface is just a way to say, hey, if you want to be a database for our app, here are the function and method and stuff like that. The method and property you need to have to say, hey, I'm a database. So the first one is going to be get all podcasts. It's going to be a function who's going to return a promises. And here we're going to figure out something after that. After that, I want to have also a subscribe to podcast function, who's going to be a function here we're going to receive a podcast. We're going to type this thing, don't worry. And this thing's gonna return a promises with a void, so we don't return the thing, return the thing. And also we want to have a function called, not a function, but a property called isReady as a type boolean. So now here, what I want to do is I'm gonna create a new SRC. I'm gonna, inside the SRC, I'm gonna create a new directory called models. And this thing's gonna be called podcast model. So here what I show you, this is not something I will have done through this project. It's just more for learning, so keep that in mind. So here I'm gonna export a class podcast model. So the only thing podcast model is gonna be, it's gonna just be a class object who's gonna receive some stuff from the constructor and it's gonna just kind of be like a DTO, something like that, like a data transfer object. It's gonna be a bit more simpler to work with that after that. So the first thing we're gonna save is gonna be artist. It's gonna be a type of string. We're gonna also save the episode count as a number. I want also to save the feed URL because you're gonna want to reuse it when the user is gonna subscribe to this thing. Also, we want the name. I don't gonna call that podcast name just because it's a podcast model, so it makes sense. Then this is the podcast name, and I'm also gonna save the thumbnail, the string. Now I want to pass them as the constructor. So what I can do a command N to say give me a constructor, and I can just select everything, click OK. So now that create me a constructor with everything like that. So as you can see, the first thing we need to pass is artist, episode count, feed, URL, and stuff like that. But one thing you can do to make our life easier is to wrap all of that inside an object. And here we can call this thing params, who's gonna make our life a bit more easier after that. If you want to do params, and params. The reason why is because I feel like when you have more than 2 or 3 arguments, it becomes messy because you need to remember the order. So now you can just pass an object. Perfect. So now here our database contract gonna need to return a podcast model array, and here subscribe to podcast gonna receive podcast model. We import from model like that. So now after that, inside my services, I'm gonna create a new services called SQlite services.ts, and this SQlite services is gonna be a class who his only job is gonna be to implement this database contract and give us the information we need. Finally, the information we care about, but touching with the SQlite. So here is the class. So here, one sec, I just need to save the name QLite for the project directory. And now here, I'm gonna import SQlite from React Native SQlite storage. Perfect. And this class, I want it to implement the database contract. By asking that, the SQlite services have an error right now because we need to implement all the members. So I'm gonna say, hey, implement all of those 3 members. As you can see, isReady is gonna be a public type, and it's gonna be a type Boolean. So what I can do is by default, it's gonna be a type false. Here I need to import podcast model, like that. So now, here are the methods we need to care about. But the first thing, we need to connect to the DB. So here in this SQlite services, I'm gonna have a private method called DB, who's gonna be equal to the SQlite database. Inside my constructor, I'm gonna say _DB equal SQlite.open database. And now here you pass it some param about how you want to open the database. The first thing you need to pass is the name. So for the name, it's gonna be pretty simple. I'm gonna call that db.sqlite. For the location, here you have default document in library. So if you go and click here, this is much more for iOS, but where do we want to save it? So by default, that's gonna save that to the local database subdirectory. It's gonna be not visible to iTunes and not backed by iCloud. If you use library, that's gonna be backed by iCloud, but not visible to iTunes. And if you use document, that's gonna be visible to iTunes and backed up by iCloud. For me, I think that's the thing I want to do. I'm gonna say document in my case. After that, this thing here receives 2 callbacks. The first one is when you have a success, and the second one is when you have an error. So the first one, when we have a success, I'm gonna say console log SQlite database connect, like that. When I have an error, I'm gonna just console log SQlite database error, and I'm gonna pass the error. You can surely, and you should surely handle that much better, but in our case, this is not something we really care about. After that, I'm gonna create a function private. It's gonna be an async function. We're gonna have an init init. And this function is going to be called when its database is connected. So here is going to be where we're going to finally create our table if the table don't exist. So I'm going to use backtips because I want to use a multi-line. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say create table if not exist podcast. I'm going to do parenthesis. And right there, I'm going to say, I want to save a name. It's going to be a varchar of 255 characters. It's going to be unique. So that's going to become an index. We're going to have also episode count is going to be an int. And the default value is going to be 0 if you don't pass it. After that, we're going to have a feed URL. It's going to be a type of text. We're going to also have an artist as a type of text. And we're going to also have a thumbnail as a type of text. Like that. So now, after this thing is done, and this function is finished, now I can pass my this ready to become true. You see this is ready right there to become true. So finally here, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's gonna create a table if it don't exist podcast with those 5 columns. After that, here we need to create the logic to get all the podcasts and to subscribe. So we're gonna start with the get all podcasts. The first thing is we're gonna create an array here. Right there. And that's gonna be an array of podcast model. And by default, it's gonna be an empty array. After that, I'm gonna run this.db. I'm gonna create a premises from here. I know they use premises and stuff like that. I just feel like it's better in my mind to go this way. So this.db that transaction. We're gonna use transaction. You can use execute SQL, but in this case we don't really care. So here we're gonna receive our transaction scope. So now I can call it execute SQL, and now I'm gonna say, hey, select everything from podcast. After that, the second argument here is the argument you want to pass if it's more like when you insert and stuff like that. And the other one here is going to be again the transaction, but also with the result. Like that. So now we need to do some plain stuff. We need to look over each of the elements. So I'm going to say I equals 0. I is smaller than the result that. What did I miss? Oops, sorry. Let's put a T. So result that rows. So the rows you're gonna receive back and the length and I++, so a plain for loop. And now here we're gonna receive the row, so the element himself. So result that rows that item. And you see all you can receive the item is by asking, hey, give me the item at index I. So the I index we create here. And finally here we can, after that, push to our podcast array where we're gonna push a new podcast model. And now right there we can fill the elements. So row that name. For that here we need thumbnail, so row that thumbnail. After that we're gonna add artist, so row that artist. After that we're gonna add episode count, but now look here, you need to type it episode count like that because we save it in this way. And finally feed URL is going to be row that feed URL the same ID because I want to use a snake case with SQlite. So when this thing is done and the for loop is finished right there, I can now resolve with my podcast array right there. Make sure you are outside of this element. And now execute SQL. If you look here, you finish right there. So you have also an error callback where here you're gonna receive the error, and now here you can reject. It's not the error callback. One sec. You can reject now the error like that. Perfect. A lot of stuff, but yeah, it's okay like that. So select everything from podcast. We pass no argument. We receive the result object with a result set. Inside that, we look over the rows length because you're gonna receive an array of rows. And now you want to get the rows element, so the current element, by asking for the item at this index. You push this element by creating that as a podcast model. So like I told you, it's a DTO, so that data transfer object. It's gonna be simpler after that to work with it. And after that, you resolve if everything is working, and if you have any kind of error, you reject it because we return a new promises, because this is what it's asked by the contract. Oops, sorry, I just want to put public, and I'm gonna put public here. You don't need, but this is how I do it. And now for the subscribe to podcast. So how can we insert element? So you're gonna say return new promises with resolve and reject. Inside your promises now, you're gonna use again your DB. I'm gonna use transaction. I'm gonna receive the transaction scope. I'm gonna use after that execute SQL, and now insert into podcast, so the name of the table. We want to insert artist, episode, count, feed URL, name, and thumbnail. After that, the thumbnail. After that, we're gonna have a values, and now after that, you can put 5 times the interrogation point. So here it's what you're gonna pass. Or for me, what I like to pass more, it's $1, $1, $2, $3, $4, and $5. After that, the second element here is gonna be the argument you want to pass. So you need to go and follow the order. So from the podcast, we're gonna have artist, podcast.episode.com, podcast.feed URL, and podcast.name, and finally podcast.thumbnail. Also, if this is easier for you, podcast model is maybe not the good name, maybe podcast DTO would have been better. So it's your choice. After that here, we're gonna receive 2 callbacks. When we have a good thing and when we have a bad thing. We're gonna go to fix the error first. So when we have an error, I'm gonna say console log error insert podcast. I'm gonna pass the error and I'm gonna reject with the error. But when it's good, when it's working well, I'm gonna just console log podcast insert, and I'm gonna resolve, because remember, this thing is supposed to return nothing. That's it. So the database kind of logic is done. Now how can we use that? So I'm gonna create a context, and I'm gonna call that DB context. And now here it's gonna be where we're gonna wrap our database logic and stuff like that with React. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna import a const DB context, who's gonna be equal. So I'm gonna import React to a React context. After that here, I'm gonna export a DB provider, who's gonna be the logic for that. So remember, the provider, the way I work with that, it's a pass my DB context. I just say provider, and now here I say React FC to get the props. We're gonna have access to the props at children. Oh shit! I make a typo. Props at children. Okay. So DB context gonna have 2 things. So I'm gonna do the typing first. I'm gonna create an interface here. So DB context props. Here we're gonna have podcast, who's gonna be a podcast model array, and we're gonna have a function called sub to podcast, who's gonna here be a function. We're gonna receive a podcast as a podcast model, and this thing is gonna return a premises with void. Now here I can say db context props and fill the element we need. That's it. So now here I'm gonna create our value. Who here need to receive is stuff, and now here we can pass a value from here. So how are we gonna work with that? So in React we have state, so why not using that? Podcast, set podcast, React use state, podcast model array. That's it. So now here I can pass podcast. After that, here we need a function called sub to podcast, who's gonna be an async function, who here gonna receive a podcast as a podcast model. Each job is gonna be first to insert and stuff like that, and doing his job, but we're gonna pass it right there. So now, what I want to do, it's how are we gonna work with the DB. So we're gonna make use of ref. So oops, I'm gonna do const db equal react.use ref, and this ref here is gonna be a iDatabase contract or null and null. I'm gonna show you why I need to put null. You're gonna see in a moment. So now here what I can do, it's I can do a use effect where I'm gonna check the db current that is ready. So if db current that is ready, I'm gonna do some job. I'm gonna do the async call right there as an inline async, calling himself. And now here what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do if db.current const podcast with underscore. So I want to keep it in this code. Await db.current that get all podcasts. I'm gonna say set podcast equal to the podcast right there. And now I don't understand why he's carrying here, but okay, I know, but yeah. So now here I want to create my use effect where we're gonna set the DB. This is what I forget. I want to do this only on mount, and that's gonna be db.current.new SQlite services. Now you see he's crying about cannot assign to current because it's a read only. If you want to fix that, you can say or no like that. So now it's fixing this issue. And now I don't understand why I get this thing. I never really got this one before. And it's the same exact code. If you ask here why I didn't use the this symbol right there, it's because podcast here can become undefined, because this thing cannot exist and make this thing like that. So I just want to make TypeScript happy. And don't know why it's not, so I'm gonna just suppress for now. And now here for the sub to podcast, I'm gonna do already a db if current, and here I'm gonna say await db.current that subscribe to podcast, passing the podcast. After that I'm gonna re-get the new podcast from the db current.podcast, get upload podcast, and set podcast equal to the podcast. That's it, that's all, nothing more to do. Pretty simple. You just need to think about to care about, like, we save the podcast right there. You can you receive the db on mount. We set the db for the first time and the only time. After that, here with our use effect, at the moment the database become ready, you check when it's ready. That's going to be the first time you're going to fetch all the podcasts. And when you call sub to podcast, we insert the data to the podcast, and we also get the new by the full podcast, and we set that. So this way we don't need to care about like you just want to keep one thing in sync. So how can we use it? App.tx, I'm gonna wrap everything here with the DB provider. I'm gonna import my DB provider. Now I'm gonna save. And now SQlite database connect. So you see it's working. I'm gonna refresh SQlite database connect. It's pretty fast, okay? It's really fast. Now I want to see the data we're gonna receive. So I'm using a tool called SimSim. If you want to use it, it's SimSim right there. And the way this tool works, it's I want to have access to the SQlite database. So the name of the app, it's my podcast. So I can open that in Finder, and in Finder I can have access to the document and to the DB SQlite. And now as you can see, I'm able to open that with Table Plus. So the name of the app, and I can see our data, and now you can play with this thing, and that's the SQlite database. The reason why I use SimSim is because it's painful if you don't to find the app because the app have a really bad name. Like if we look here, look at the app name inside my simulator, it's crazy. How long is that? So it's your choice how you want to figure it out. So to see if that's gonna work, we're gonna first go to the library screen. And we're gonna say db context equal react.use context db context. I'm gonna remove this library screen, and now we're gonna map over the podcast. Map podcast. We're gonna have here a box and a text. For the text, here is gonna be podcast.name. And for the key, it's gonna be podcast.feed URL. Now you see library have no podcast at all. We are subscribed. If I refresh, nothing is there. I want to be able to subscribe, and where we're gonna do this, it's if you search for a podcast, you remember the subscribe button right there, we're gonna do this with this one. So podcast detail screen. I'm gonna go at the top of this podcast. I'm gonna do db context equal react.use context db context. I'm gonna wrap this subscribe button with touchable opacity. On press, I'm gonna do db context that sub podcast, and now this is where you have your DTO, where you need to fill all these elements. So episode con is gonna be podcast episode con, thumbnail podcast thumbnail, name is gonna be podcast podcast name, artist is gonna be podcast artist, and finally feed URL is gonna be podcast feed URL. That's it. So now if I click subscribe, you should have podcast insert. You see it's working, and now if I go back to library, I get full stack ready right there. Just to make it a bit easier to see, I'm gonna remove the center. I'm gonna put a BG white, a margin bottom of small, medium, and a padding of small, like that. Now you see, so now if I go back and I use syntax and I subscribe, syntax is right there. If I refresh, is right there also. After that, if I add example Joe Rogan, subscribe, is right there. Now the thing is, I would like my podcast order here to have an order with the name. So I'm gonna just search for something starting by A. Be your own light, okay? This thing, I'm gonna click subscribe. Now you see be your own light is right there. So you can fix that pretty quick just by it's equal. So select everything from podcast, order by name. If I do this, now you see, if I refresh, be your own light is at the top, full stack radio, syntax and everything. But the beauty of doing our DB context like that, where after you have subscribed to a podcast, you refetch, that's gonna do the order for you. So what I mean by that is you search for something, start by C, example. And we're gonna search, yeah, it's really bad. I don't know, like React. Okay, so if I subscribe to React Podcast and I go back to the library, you see now React Podcast become already in the middle right there. And like I told you, if you refresh, it's already there. If you look at Table Plus, this is what you have saved in the SQlite. You have saved the name, the episode count, the field URL, the artist, and the thumbnail. So it's really perfect. After that, you can design this thing. So I think it's pretty great. I'm gonna stop right there for today. So I hope you enjoyed this one and let me know how you feel about this thing. And also I hope SQlite is something you're gonna maybe think about in the future. So I hope you enjoy and I'm gonna talk in the next one. Bye everyone.